What's up, everybody? My name is Justin. I'm here with my boy Landon, and this is Mental Caffeine. Today, we want to talk to you a little bit about breakups and should you try to be friends with your ex after? I'm going to argue, maybe not. Not until you do this. And with that, let's get into it.
Justin, how you been? How you
My
been?
boy.
What you been up to? How's life? Have you lost any sports bets recently? What's
Yes, I have actually. It's been kind of disappointing. But shout out to the Pacers and the Knicks for going to no, sorry, the Pacers and the OKC Thunder.
Yeah, there you
Uh,
go.
Going to the finals. That's awesome. But no, man, you know me, boy. I'm just working, just enjoying the grind, doing things, doing big old things.
Yeah.
And what about you, boy? What you been up to?
I mean, I've been working as well. Been trying to gear up for this episode. I know lately it's been a little bit of a challenge for us to get the ball rolling again, but we're here and we're doing it now.
We here, but
I've actually had a family reunion going on recently, and
oh shoot.
I mean, you know this, but I come from a very big family, so our family reunions are not like, oh, let's show up at said location, eat for 2 hours, and then not see each other again for another year.
You
Like
there all
our
day?
our family reunions are 3 days long, and we like rent out a space like on one of the lakes here. And now back in the day when I was younger, I was able to like make it to those things more, just because like I didn't have adult responsibilities. But this year I was able to go out there and play a little bit of wiffle ball and just spend some time
Nice.
with family. And it's really weird seeing like, because I'm 31, it's really weird seeing my younger cousins who are now like they're like 28 years old. It's just weird, like
Grown ups.
because in my brain they're still like my young little brothers. So um life is weird. It's weird seeing people change and grow up and all that. But it's been cool. It's been cool to be around family, and it kind of for small I guess for a small amount of time I kind of feel like a kind of like a kid again when I'm out there.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome, man. That's
Hmm.
awesome. Well, yeah, man, like you said, dude, it's been a little bit since we've been able to get into one. I was thinking about our episode last time, man, about why relationships change people, and I kind of wanted to bridge off of that and talk about breakups a little bit. What do you think about
Yeah,
just that whole subject matter there, boy? You think we're ready for that? You think we're ready to get into something like that?
I think we are. But I'm sure there are probably people out there that are not. It's definitely, I mean, let's just call it what it is. That it can be a tough topic because I feel like almost everyone I've ever talked to about breakups, specifically like the aftermath and how to like handle the relationship with that person afterwards. I feel like everyone I talk to has a different opinion on it and how they approach it. And because like everyone is so different on it and it's so muddy, it's hard to find what's actually like the right thing to do. And I do air quotes because um I think that can fluctuate just depending on people and
100%.
your relationship with that person. I don't think there is an objective like, I think there's objective like way to handle it in a sense like depending on a lot of factors, what the relationship was like, how it ended. We'll get into all that. But but yeah, it's there's a lot there for sure.
Right, man. And like you said, Landon, to be able to speak to every specific nuanced situation is well beyond the aims of this podcast here. Definitely want to encourage anybody who's going through a significantly difficult time to maybe consider some therapy and all that good stuff. All we can do here is take a pass at something on a 10,000 foot view and then kind of get a little bit more specific as we need to. But like we always say, Landon, this ain't therapy. I ain't nobody's
Right.
therapist in this capacity, and I'm just a guy with some thoughts. So with that said, man, I want to see what you think about this, man. It's been my experience that a lot of times when people go through a breakup, one of the first things they would like to do after that is seek friendship with their ex partner in
Mm,
some way or another. That seems to be the case whether you're a teenager, a little older than that. Like we have this kind of desire. It seems like by and large a lot of times to seek some type of camaraderie with our significant other after the breakup happens. And what do you think? Has that been your experience? What you've seen, what you maybe experienced yourself, or what you've been around?
yeah, so I've definitely run into people who, and I mean I myself I've been through a breakup before in my life. And I most people probably have to one degree or another. Yeah, I've definitely run into people who have tried to like I guess push me into the direction of, well, you can still be like friends with your ex. Like you can still like there's still something to salvage there. And I'm not saying that it's not possible, but I know for me specifically, and maybe I'm jumping a little ahead here because I know this isn't really like what you asked me, but I know for me personally, almost every time it wasn't an option at the end for me, and it wasn't so much I wasn't so much making that decision because of the type of person the other party was. I was making a decision based on what was healthy for myself. And I knew because of the way I am and the way my attachment works and even some of my attachment issues that I've had to fight with in my past.
Mm.
I just knew that who I was as a person, it would be better for me and my mental health to I don't want to say cut the person off because that sounds a little heavy-handed or a little aggressive, but more so just put up a fence around me and they're outside that fence, like a fence around my life, and just sort of protect myself.
Right, right.
On one yeah, on one hand, like that's worked out in a lot of ways, and I think ultimately was the right decision for me in most situations. But then there are side effects of that, and we can dive into that a little bit more. But does that answer it, or did I
It
miss
does.
something there? Okay.
Actually, my boy, you're leading into something I think is really really important. Um, but before we launch into the full scope of it, let me just say this. I have to make a couple of
Hmm.
assumptions before I really expound on all this stuff. So let me just talk about things that I'm assuming when I'm about to say what I'm about to say about how you should navigate the possibility of being friends with your partner afterwards. So I'm have to assume that a person watching this talking about the breakup and considering friendship with their ex-partner, I'm going to assume that the relationship that you were in with them was significant to you, that there was love involved in some capacity or another, or a deep care involved with that. I have to assume that, and that's a little bit different than if it's just a relationship where maybe it's just a fling, or maybe it was just something small, or maybe it was something that really wasn't a big deal to you, but maybe it's a big deal to them. Um, so I'm going to assume that there was real feelings involved, real love involved. I'm also going to assume that whether or not you're the person who was broken up with, or you're the person who initiated the breakup, that it probably wasn't an easy time to navigate, and maybe still isn't all that easy of a time to navigate. And what I'm also going to assume, Landon, is that the viewer of this type of stuff is going to be open to the idea of friendship, or at least considering the idea of friendship, but maybe there's some concern of what that might mean or look like on the back end, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What do you think, Landon? Is there any other assumptions you think we maybe need to acknowledge before we kind of launch into what we're going to talk about?
I think you covered it pretty well there. I think so. Something I kind of want to add, and I think you were already hinting at this, is I know like a lot of times when we say the phrase or term breakup, we're talking about people who are officially together or people who are married or
Mm,
something that has an official title on it.
oh, good stuff.
Um, but the thing is, I would argue that breakup takes more forms than just that. There's times we break up with not even people who were romantically involved in. There's times we leave a friend. There's times where we had a best friend and they're no longer our best friend. Sometimes it's a quote unquote breakup with a family member. Now, I know the main meat and potatoes of today's conversation is about those romantic relationships, but I just wanted to throw out there that breakups take many forms and it's not just always romantically.
Oh my boy, I'm glad you pointed that out. And let me just say this while we're acknowledging stuff like that. This also can include people that you might not be in a relationship with. Maybe you held out significant hope that you and this person could be romantically involved, and maybe for whatever reason you just found out that they're not interested in that. And now you're kind of having to reevaluate your stance with them. These kind of things that we're going to talk about today can definitely try to apply to that also. Um, so let's kind of move into it, Lynn Landon, and
Yeah.
let's just kind of start unpacking some stuff. Okay, so again, we're going to assume this is a close thing, a close relationship that has ended. Again, whether or not you were the one who initiated it or the one who experienced it. We talked before, Landon, in our last episode
Hmm.
about the fact that relationships change people, and I think this is a way to segue off of that conversation. So for anybody who wasn't privy to that conversation, be sure to go back and look at our other videos or listen to our previous podcast about why relationships change people. But it's my assumption that relationships change everybody. And when you experience a breakup, let's talk about what that actually means, Landon. When you experience a breakup, what you're really saying is that the boundaries of this relationship that I have now with this person can't look the same as they
Mhm.
have before. Which leads us to the natural question of, well, if it can't be what it was, then what is it now? And typically, what people will try to do a lot of times is they'll try to go back to the way that it was before it was romantically involved. And typically, that's friendship of some level, of some kind, right? Where we try to go back to how it was before it maybe was a little bit more emotionally complicated. Um, and I'm going to suggest that that is not a first step that maybe we want to consider until we consider some other things. Primarily, we want to consider how were we changed by that relationship, and we also need to consider the fact that we have to change now again. Now that that relationship is no longer the same position in our lives as it used to be, we have to allow ourselves to reorient to this new place, this new reality. And I really want to encourage anyone that I can to slow down and to not feel, well, not necessarily to not feel, but to not try to act on the pressure to renegotiate those boundaries in a hurry. It happened and it was difficult and maybe still is difficult, and we need to listen to that difficulty. We need to really try to get in tune with that difficulty and try to figure out what exactly is it that makes it as difficult as it feels right now. Landon, what do you think? Because I think I've seen a lot of that where people try to kind of speed through the discomfort and go ahead and get back to a place where it's maybe not at what it was, but at least more comfortable than the initial shock and maybe emotional difficulty of going through something like that. Has that been your experience too? That pressure to kind of
Mhm.
rush through the pain and to the other side of things?
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe it is for most people, especially for that first breakup in your life. I don't know if it necessarily applies as much when you've gone through it a couple times and you've got a little bit of life under your belt and you know how to handle it a little bit better. But I can definitely say that for like the first one I went through, it was the very first thing you're trying to do is find a band-aid, find a way to just ease the hurt. And I think that's where we enter danger territory because
Mm-hmm.
it's different for so many different people. Um, some people approach it in healthy ways. As you are well aware, some people approach breakups in very unhealthy ways. But the common denominator between those two is both are scrambling to put a band-aid on it and make the pain go away quicker. Is that, yeah.
Right. And it
Um,
goes both ways. And it goes both ways, Landon. Not just the person who's experienced the breakup wants to hurry
mhm.
and get to a place where it doesn't hurt, but also the person sometimes who has done the breaking up. They don't want to hurt the other person. Again, they love that person at one point in time. They significantly care for that person. So sometimes there can be a pressure to kind of do what we can to alleviate the pain for them because of the breakup, because we maybe know how much that it hurt them, and we don't want to significantly pile on. So we kind of maybe offer friendship as kind of an olive branch of saying, hey, we can't be significantly involved the way we used to be. Maybe we can be involved as friends. And again, I would caution that maybe that is not something we need to rush to go be a part of. Um, so again, like you say, right, it's definitely more difficult the less experience one has, but no
Mhm.
matter what, it's always difficult in some ways,
Always, yeah.
especially if there's love involved. And
And plus, and
that's
plus, each relationship's different, right? Even though maybe you've gone through a breakup before, that does the next breakup won't be the same because it's a completely different individual.
right, right, and that actually leads me to my next main point here, Landon, is that we need to kind of going back to what we said previously, but just to really unpack it, we really need to understand that we were changed by that relationship and that we cannot just snap out of it in a day, in a week, in a month. We can't go back to how it used to be immediately. And that's one thing I hear a lot, Landon, about people wanting to get over it, wanting to get over the breakup, get over the relationship, or maybe they have friends in their life saying, "Hey, man, you can't keep being hung up on so and so. You just need to get over it." And I don't know if that's possible, to be honest with you, Landon. I really don't believe that that's possible because To get over it suggests that you can go back to how it was before it ever happened. And if there was real love involved, then that means there was a real shift in the way you relate to that person, the way maybe you relate to yourself or how to relationships. So it's intertwined to maybe to a part of who you are now. And so you can't just go back like it didn't happen. I think the best thing we could do is move forward with it. And part of that is really understanding how did that relationship shift you? How did that change you? Maybe it changed you in ways that was really good that you miss, or maybe that really changed you in ways that you didn't think it would, and you're not really super excited about some of those changes that happened, and maybe that's what led to the breakup in some way. But really taking a step back to study that change process and just know that okay, if it's not going to be that now, I need to really come back to center and figure out okay, what has changed and what am I comfortable with how it changed and what am I uncomfortable with how it changed. And then we need to kind of reevaluate it from there and really take a self inventory about what happened and maybe what the next step is before we try to offer this branch of friendship. What do you think about that idea, taking that self inventory?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of where I was headed, kind of on the tail end of what you're talking about there. The thing about breakups is, so obviously, like if you invest a lot of time and love into someone, obviously that's going to make a breakup hard. But I think what a lot of people maybe don't talk about as much, and I'm speaking from experience because I think when I went through, one of my bad breakups when I was younger, at the time, and when I say at the time, I don't mean just like that week. I mean for a couple years there, I it hurt, and I was like, man, like I thought it was just a big like suck fest. Like I thought it sucked. Only was it years later that I realized that yeah, even though that was also part of the hurt at the time, ultimately I came out better for it. I learned and I adapted, and um, it's just one of those things you don't feel it in the moment. In the moment, it feels like, I mean, it feels like life's just taking a dump on you, is what it feels like. And it's kind of a woe is me moment, and sometimes it takes just time and going back to what you were saying, just some self reflection and looking in the mirror and um, realizing that you've learned from it, and part of the hurt is also a breakup reveals not only your partner's mistakes and maybe the issues you had with them, but it also reveals the issues you have within yourself. And I think a lot of people don't like to see that. It's one thing to point at someone else and realize, well, I left them because of A, B, and Z, A, B, and Z, A, B, and C. Um, but then when we turn the mirror on ourselves and we start looking at the ways we contributed to the breakup, um, sometimes, and I can speak for myself here as well. Sometimes we realize that we were the problem,
Right.
and
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 it comes back
and
it comes back to that taking an inventory thing, Landon. And if
yeah,
there's anything in particular I would want anybody to take away from that idea of self inventory is to slow down. Slow down.
yeah.
We have the rest of your life to figure you out. So we shouldn't be in a hurry, right? Especially after something like that. If it feels like a total gut punch with this breakup, whether you were the one who broke up with the person or were you're the one who got broke up with, if it's on your mind heavy, if it still brings an emotional response when you think about it too much, um, then trying to just rush past that and trying to just turn it off is not reasonable. I think. Now I can
I don't
understand
think it's
why a
fair to
person.
yourself. I don't think it's
Yeah,
fair.
right. Because you know what it assumes, Landon? It assumes that if you love somebody, you can just turn it off. And I don't know a single person that I've ever talked to who's or experienced myself that if I actually love them, I can't turn it off, even if I have every good reason to turn it off. Even if on paper they were the worst person to me at pivotal times, if I still have a love for them, even if it makes me uncomfortable with myself, I still can feel that care for them. And that makes it really complicated sometimes. And I think we live in a world that really wants to simplify that process, Landon, and it's not simple. And again, like you said, but this could be for romantic partners. This could be for any relationship of any kind, family, friends. Pick a thing. It can all apply to that. And what we have to do is really reflect on how things have changed, what things may be changing now, and to take an inventory so that way, and this is the next point, so that way we can take a perspective of growth. What did you learn from that past relationship? What did that relationship teach you about yourself, about what you need in relationships, about what made you feel secure, what made you feel a little insecure, what is it that made you feel reassured at times? What are the times where you wish you could have gotten reassurance? Because what you might find when you take that inventory and you take that perspective of, I need to grow from this experience, you'll find that maybe things that you at one point didn't think were all that important maybe turns out was a little bit more important than we thought. And maybe other things
Yep.
that you used to not think were all that important, you know, maybe it was a little bit more important. I think, and I don't know if I said the same thing twice. Did I say the same thing twice?
You did, but it's okay. It's fine.
Okay,
You're just driving the point home. It's all good.
sure. Well, some things that were important aren't, and some things that aren't important are. And so
Yeah.
to say that we should know that stuff, we can't know that until we slow down and really take that inventory to really reflect on those things. And that is why, until we can do that self inventory, that's why friendship can be so difficult, because we don't even know where we are right now to be able to offer friendship in the same way. Um, and it makes things really complicated a lot of the times when we try to be friends with someone we used to have significant emotions for. What do you
I
think? What
mean,
do you think?
we're all changing constantly. Who I am now is not who I was at 25. Who I was at 25 is not who I was at 16 years old. And so the relationships that we have with people around us, the same applies to them. So not only are we constantly changing and the things in our lives, our priorities shift and our viewpoints on things change, but also the people that we have relationship do. And so that's why I think you hear a lot of stories of, and I'm just going to use like romantic relationships, for example. You hear people say things along the lines of, well, we outgrew each other.
Hmm.
And do I think that that's a thing? I would say this, it's debatable. I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to that. But what I will say is there comes a point in time where relationships have to be navigated when that growth does come. Because both parties can be growing, but maybe they feel like they're growing in different directions. And now we're like really getting, and I know we're really getting into the weeds of like kind of almost like an opinionated space on, well, is that something that actually happens or do they just not love each other anymore?
Either way, I
Um,
think it's about growth and it's about adaptation.
yeah.
And this is why breakups can be so difficult. Have you ever heard, Landon? Have you ever heard, like maybe on social media or maybe even people they break up with their partner, right? They seek friendship and things seem to be going well, and then all of a sudden one night one of them gets lonely and they send a text, and it's the whole like, maybe we're not just friends, maybe it's a little bit more,
Yeah.
and then that makes it emotionally confusing for one or both people involved. You ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
That late night text. One of the reasons, and this is kind of the next point, one of the reasons that happens, Landon, is because we haven't negotiated the new boundaries yet. I don't know if that's very easy to do until we do a self inventory about what we need now and how do we move forward, in terms of how do we want to restructure this relationship. And instead, people tend to just kind of rush right into it. And if you rush right into it, those boundaries, those expectations haven't been renegotiated yet. And because they haven't been renegotiated yet, it's hard to know where exactly the lines are. And this is why I hesitate for people to become friends with their ex-partner right after a breakup, because we need to self-evaluate, we need to take a perspective of growth, and then we need to renegotiate these boundaries and these expectations for this new relationship. And that means you have to talk to your ex-partner and talk
Mm.
about those types of things and work those things out. And if that feels uncomfortable and that feels scary or that feels challenging for whatever reason, then maybe that's an indicator that we might not need to seek friendship right now. Then.
Yeah. Have you have you been in that I'm just going to put you on the spotlight here for a second. Have you been in that situation where whether it was you were dating someone or seeing someone or whatever, have you personally been in that situation where, after the fact that you guys decided it wasn't going to work out for whatever reason, there was still an olive branch extended to try and continue the friendship? Have
Yeah.
you been in something like that? And
Yeah.
and and at the time, what was your immediate reaction, I guess?
Um, well, there was a few times, but especially when I was young, it was just about avoiding pain. I'll be friends with you as long as you stay in my life. That more or less was the
Yeah.
sentiment. Um,
And where are
the
those
older,
people now?
couldn't tell you. The older I get, the more I realize that and of course I study this stuff for a living, right? As a marriage therapist, like this is kind of my whole deal. But that it's more complicated than that, and trying to just slow it down and trying to figure out, and that we don't have to solve everything day one afterwards, right? We can give it time, and I need the time to reevaluate myself, reevaluate this thing going forward. And when we talk about the nature of relationships in general, and like the thing about renegotiating expectations and boundaries was something that we talked about in our previous episode. Um, or sorry, the initial navigation of expectations and boundaries. But now, after a shift like that, in terms of from a romantic context to a friendship context, or whatever it is that we're doing now, um, it has to be renegotiated. It has to be reevaluated, and we have to really feel out what it's going to be like. So I'll tell you why that's so difficult, because there's so many things happening internally, mentally, and emotionally at the same time that we're trying to figure all those things out.
Hmm.
And so, by and large, and this is not, I guess this is a generalization, but by and large, I think it's more helpful, more times than not, to take a break from the presence of the other person for a time, to allow
For sure.
yourself that self inventory, to allow yourself for that growth. Um, So I think that by and large is more helpful, more times than it's not helpful. But I really want to kind of unpack that a little bit more. But I want to see what you think about that idea of just kind of taking a break and just maybe separating, allowing yourself space to renegotiate those things.
So I'm in the camp of I 100% think that that's a healthy choice, regardless of like whatever style attachment you have or maybe attachment issues that you struggle with. I just think across the board that's almost healthy for anyone who's involved in a breakup like that, especially a romantic one. Um, I know for me, it was a game changer to just honestly not only be out of the presence of that person, but I even removed myself just out of even the realm of like wanting to enter into a romantic relationship with anyone else for a time. That's not so much the case now, but there was a period of time there where I was just I completely didn't even want to be involved or even think about possibly dating another person. And a lot of growth came out of that. But I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that that was easy. Um, in fact, I would say emotionally that was one of the hardest points in my life because,
Sure.
particularly because it was my first like real breakup, and so you learn a lot of hard lessons about not only dating but yourself in a very short amount of time.
Right. So
And it's a major I would say it's one of the bigger growing pains that you experience at a young age.
and let's talk about like this idea of taking space, okay? Because I want to really unpack what I'm not saying here. What I'm not saying when I suggest taking space, what I'm not saying is that you angrily go on there and unadd them from every social media platform, or that you delete their number, or that you give them one big old final thing and all those things. Now, maybe that's part of it. I mean, I can't speak to specifics. Maybe your therapist, your individual therapist could help you sort that out. But I would say what I mean is this taking of space is to take some pressure off. Is to take a step back and just take some pressure off and try to give it time to settle. That's
It
a little
almost
bit different.
the term popped in my head, and I'm sure you've heard it. It's a bit cliche, but have you ever heard the well, date yourself for a while? Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I don't know about that, but
Yeah, but
the
I bring that
sentiment.
up because I wanted to bounce that off you and kind of see what your thoughts are on that as a practicing professional.
I think the sentiment of it is you should reevaluate yourself in light of what you've been through, which is exactly, I think, what we talked about at the top of this thing, right? So the sentiment of it, I agree with. The the thing about taking that space, a lot of times, Landon, especially if it's an emotionally significant relationship that you're coming out of, and particularly if it wasn't your choice to come out of it, what many people find themselves doing is they go from this extreme where they were once madly in love, now the breakup has happened, and they have a tendency or a strong pull to really become very passionately convinced that they do not love this person. In fact, maybe they resent this person, or maybe even something close to hate this person. And sometimes people have been known to use that mindset as a way of trying to move past the memory of that relationship. And one quick thing, and we can unpack this if you want, but one quick thing and that I would want to point out is to say that hate is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love.
Mm,
Because when you
for sure.
hate somebody, let's talk about that for a second, Lennon. When you love
Yeah.
somebody and when you hate somebody, let's think about the similarities there. Both of those states of being involve having that person in your mind. It involves putting a lot of emotional energy in. It involves a lot of expectation. It involves certain uh, feelings that come along when their name is brought up, when their presence is near you, or when other people who are mutually involved with the two of you, it changes all of those things. But love and hate are two sides of the same coin. But when we talk about indifference, indifference is the lack of energy, the lack of intention, the lack of attention, the lack of expectation, the lack of emotional response, right? And ideally, what makes the best friends after a relationship is when there is a romantic sense of indifference after a breakup happens, where I don't hate them and I wish them well. And I'm going to be doing what I need to do over here. And hopefully they have a good life.
Yeah.
That's the direction we want to go in. Um, but if we go into this mindset of I just don't like them and I hate them and I don't want now let me say this. Sometimes a person might feel that way who has gone through legitimate, like really difficult things, abuse,
Sure.
all those things. And those, I think, are outside of the purview of this conversation. Those extreme things, definitely want to give credence to that because sometimes there is legitimate reason to feel those things. But what I'm talking about is just trying to use this mindset as a way of moving past a romantic relationship. Not to say that there's something that maybe happened that caused it, right? But when we are trying to take the space, that space is meant to again relieve some pressure and allow us time to try to figure out what we need now from this relationship and what is it that the other person needs now from this relationship and give us time to consult with ourselves and reflect and then maybe we can approach them differently later.
I think sometimes, well, it's kind of like the concept of forgiveness, right? Like, and when you talk about forgiveness, it's hard to forgive because it almost like for like in our human psyche, especially if things ended on like a bad term, right? We we tend to think that, well, if I forgive them, then they've won. But and I know this is cliche, but I think it applies to the to a breakup really well. But really, forgiveness is for yourself. And so I want to, and the reason I'm bringing that up is I want to pivot and just bring up the fact that the same thing applies to when you go through a breakup with someone, and instead of like being angry or lashing out, because I think naturally some of that's going to be there just because there's so many emotions flying around at the time. And you'll go through waves of sadness and waves of anger and all things like that. But um, if you can find a way to just ultimately get to a place where you're at peace with it and you wish them nothing but the best and you both can move on with your lives, like the concept of it feels like that, well, doesn't feel like something you want to do, but in reality, it's the best thing you can do for yourself.
think really, Landon, that point of view that you're talking about, where you're saying like I do want the best for them, and let's just move on. I think at that point, that's when you're ready to be friends. But
Mm.
until you're into that place, you may not be ready. Um,
And do you think that there are, and I'm sure there are, but I just want to bounce it off of you. Do you think there are people that maybe never get to that spot, and so ultimately the best decision is to just not be in contact with that person?
yeah, yeah, definitely. Now, it goes,
Yeah.
of course, I'm going to keep saying this because I can't speak to everybody's individual experience, but I think by and large, sometimes
Right.
that can happen. Now, it's not guaranteed to happen. Um, there's all kinds of individual factors that can play into how we're going to navigate this particular thing. That's why, for anybody who's gone through a significant event like that, I would definitely recommend an individual therapist for themselves. And when we think
I
about
think you
friendship,
could I think you could take it a step further and say that there are some situations, depending on, how bad it was or how bad the situation was, that sometimes it's for the best to take that approach. Um, I certainly don't want to hop on here and be like, well, if you're not on good terms with the person, no matter how bad the relationship was, then that's a you problem. No, I do think sometimes there are people in your life that maybe just don't need to be in your life anymore, and I think sometimes that is the healthiest approach.
right? Remember, we're not trying to move on; we're trying to move forward.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out what exactly that means, especially in the immediate aftermath of something. And when I say immediate aftermath, that could be a day, that could be a week, that could be a month, that could be a year, that could be 10 years. It really just depends on all those factors that we're naming. Um, and when we talk about becoming friends with a person that you've dated, we have to account for the emotional difficulty that can come along with it. See, this isn't just a logical problem, Landon, right? It's not just about, well, I just need to know that, it's not going to be this way anymore, and I need them to know it's not going to be that way anymore, and then we'll be fine. Well, on paper, yeah, sure. But if us human beings only ever did what was good on paper, then we'd all have fantastic lives, right? It ain't that easy. It's risky to become friends with the person that you were significantly emotionally involved with. It's risky to become emotionally involved with anybody. Um, and we can get into that later on. But that's what actually makes relationships have such emotional fulfillment, because there's an act of when other than a couple of different scenarios, when there's vulnerability shared and nurtured and protected, there's no other closer things in our lives than the people that we feel vulnerable with, connected with, safe with, and looked after and cared for. So we need to know that before we go off and go into another relationship, or if we go into a friendship with our ex, or whatever the case might be, there's always going to be risk involved. And so one thing I want to see what you think about this, Lynn, is that I tell folks this all the time, that to remember there is a difference between saying, "Are you ready? Are you ready to move on? Are you ready to date again? Are you ready to become friends with your ex? Or are you ready enough to try?" Ready enough and ready are two different things. And when we
Mm.
talk about specifically being friends with your ex, are we ready enough to try to have a conversation with them about friendship, to renegotiate those expectations, to renegotiate those boundaries? Now, maybe it'll blow up in your face, and that's a risk we have to evaluate. Or maybe you'll be wanting to be friends, and they'll tell you, no, I think it's better if we're not. And that might suck. But are you ready enough to embrace that risk, to try to renegotiate those things if friendship is something important to you? Assuming, again, that you've done that self evaluation, that you've taken that growth mindset, and that you've tried to um, do what you can to reevaluate where you are currently in response to everything that you've been through. But to remember that there's a big difference between are you ready versus are you ready enough?
Mm. Yeah, and that's tough, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they go through something like that, they want to look for clarity. But unfortunately, the path to clarity is painful because it involves taking that risk. It involves trying to figure out, and there's all kinds of things in that package. What did they do? What did I do? What could maybe I have worked on to improve things? Um, how do they still feel about me? Can we? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Because whenever you go through something like that, you just have so many questions running through your head, as far as, well, what could have been done, woulda, coulda, shoulda, what could have been done different, could it still possibly, I mean, even the thought of, could it still possibly work out again in the future, like all these things come rushing in your head. And and it's tricky because I do think there are some situations where people feel ready enough to reach out and try to find that clarity and to quote unquote get their closure, right? But I also think there are, depending on how volatile the situation is, I also think there are situations where, as painful as it is to be left in the dark, sometimes it's not worth pursuing that closure because in your attempt you may not ever get it.
And then what everything you just named right there, everything you just said is about that
Hmm.
inventory thing that we're talking about
Yeah.
to evaluate all those things. And
Because
um,
one thing, and I'm sorry, but it's kind of on my brain right now, because one thing is you can you might get closure from the other party, but one thing that's guaranteed is if you self-reflect, you're sure to get closure from yourself.
mhm, mhm. And we need to heal first.
Mm.
That needs to be the number one priority. And when we reach out, we need to understand that it is a risk. Now, maybe it's a risk where we found worth it and willing to take, but it is a risk. And if the risk doesn't pay off, it will hurt. You know what will hurt worse is if we take a risk and it doesn't pay off and we haven't healed at the same time, right? So we need to self-reflect. We need to try to grow. We need to try to take some pressure off. We need to try to slow down. We need to try to listen to our self-reflections about what we've been through. And you know how we do here at Mental Caffeine Boy, we're all about like leaning into your support system. You know,
Yeah.
talk to your friends, talk to your loved ones, go to therapy, do whatever you need to do. Utilize those resources to help you in that inventory process and in that growth process, and even to help you navigate how to have some of those conversations when you do feel like the risk is starting to be worth it to try to get that clarity that you talked about. And then after that, after those boundaries are renegotiated, after that risk has been successfully taken and it pays off because the other person is willing and able to renegotiate that stuff with you, then you're ready to be friends. Then you're ready to be friends. But I would argue, generally speaking, not until then. Not until
Yeah.
then. Because if we go too early, Landon, we'll just end up repeating the same cycle of this back and forth between I love them and I want to date them and it hurts me that I can't be with them to I just want them in my life at any for any reason at any cost. And then we go so far back and forth that we don't know what to do with that when we get into that space. So we need to slow down. We need to take inventory. We need to grow. We need to
Yeah.
reflect. We need to utilize our support system. We need to have people that we can get some insight from, some guidance from. Then we need to renegotiate those boundaries. We need to take that risk if it feels like we're ready, or we need to separate entirely and not even worry about this idea of friendship. And then after all that's done, then we can try to be friends if we think that that's worth it. Um, and maybe sometimes we feel like it's worth it, but they don't. Well, you can't have a friendship that goes one way. So then now we have to start that process over again and self-reflect
Right.
in light of their unwillingness to want to be friends with us. Now what do we do? How do we grow from that? How do we reflect on that? And how do we renegotiate who we are, who we want to be, and all those things? And so it's a continuous process.
It is. Well, man, you kind of got ahead of me there as far as I was ready to kind of set you up, but honestly, you wrapped it up perfectly there as far as just putting it all in a neat package for getting to a spot where we possibly can be friends with our ex. Um, well, we're just about out of time, Justin. I want to once again, episode 6. I appreciate you being here.
Mhm.
For any of our listeners out there, don't be afraid to open up. Don't be afraid to find a support system to help you, not just through issues like this, but any of the issues that we cover in our episodes or anything you just got going on in your life. This is
Definitely
Mental
so.
Caffeine. Yeah, yeah. We're Mental Caffeine. I'm Landon,
I'm Justin.
and we'll catch you next time. See ya.
Peace.